Saving a bleeding Hell's Angel from a mangled desert wreck seemed like a simple act of kindness to an 8-year-old girl. Her terrified mother, however, knew they had just painted a target on their backs. Come morning, 150 roaring Harley-Davidsons surrounded their diner, and they weren't there to say thank you. The Mojave Desert is an unforgiving place. It doesn't care about your plans, your past, or your secrets. For Sarah Reynolds, a 32-year-old single mother, running a rundown diner on a forgotten stretch of Route 93, the desert was both a sanctuary and a prison. The diner, the rust and rose, barely saw enough trucker traffic to keep the neon sign buzzing, but it was safe. It was quiet, until a blistering Tuesday evening in late August. Her 8-year-old daughter, Onyx, was out back playing in the dirt. Onyx was a child of the desert, fearless, curious, and entirely too trusting for the harsh world she inhabited. She was busy constructing a fortress out of discarded soda cans and smooth river stones when the deafening screech of tires shattered the twilight silence. It wasn't just a skid, it was the sickening, metallic crunch of heavy machinery meeting solid rock, followed by a violent tumbling sound that made the ground beneath Onyx's worn sneakers vibrate. Then, a heavy thud and silence. Onyx dropped her stones. Most children would have run inside to their mothers, but Onyx, driven by a naive instinct to help, pushed through the brittle sagebrush toward the highway bend. Down in the steep, rocky culvert off the shoulder, a massive Harley-Davidson lay on its side. The front wheel twisted at a grotesque angle, hot oil sizzling against the cracked exhaust. About 10 feet away lay the rider. He was a mountain of a man, clad in heavy, scuffed denim and a leather cut that had seen decades of miles. He lay face down, unmoving. Onyx slid down the embankment, the loose gravel tearing at her jeans. "Mister," she called out, her voice a tiny bell against the vast desert wind. "Are you okay?" A low groan escaped the man. He rolled over, clutching his side, and Onyx gasped. His face was a map of old scars and fresh, terrifying trauma. Blood poured from a jagged laceration on his forehead. But what was worse was the dark crimson stain rapidly spreading across the right side of his leather vest. As he turned, Onyx saw the unmistakable emblem on his back, the winged death head. The curved rockers read Hell's Angels on top and Arizona Nomads on the bottom. In the center, a small rectangular patch read Dutch. Kid. Dutch coughed, spitting a mixture of dust and blood. Get back. You're bleeding, Onyx stating the obvious with the calm only a child possesses. She stepped closer. My mum has a first aid kit. We have Mickey Mouse Band-Aids. Dutch let out a weak, rattling chuckle that quickly turned into a wince of agony. Ain't gonna cut it, little bird. Somebody ran me off. Black SUV. He grabbed her tiny shoulder with a massive, tattooed hand. His grip was weak, trembling. Listen to me. Onyx. Where are you? Sarah's voice pierced the evening air, shrill with absolute panic. The screen door of the diner slammed open. Onyx didn't move away from the biker. Instead, she unzipped her favorite pink windbreaker, a garment far too warm for the desert, but one she refused to part with, and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound on Dutch's side. "Mum down here, he's hurt!" Onyx screamed back. Sarah appeared at the edge of the culvert, her eyes widening in sheer horror. She knew exactly what she was looking at. Growing up in California, she had heard the stories. You don't mess with the club. You don't get involved in their business, and you certainly don't find one bleeding out in your backyard. Onyx, step away from him right now. Sarah scrambled down the ditch, grabbing her daughter's arm to pull her back. No, Mum, he's dying. He needs pressure. You taught me that when I cut my knee. Onyx fought back, her small hands firmly pressing the now blood-soaked pink jacket against the biker's ribs. Dutch looked up at Sarah, the imposing outlaw, a man who had ridden with legendary figures like Sonny Barger and survived decades of turf wars, was entirely at the mercy of a terrified waitress and a stubborn 8-year-old. "Please," Dutch wheezed, his eyes losing focus. "Don't call the cops. Highway patrol. They're bought. The guy's in the SUV. I have to call an ambulance. You're bleeding to death," Sarah cried, her hands shaking as she pulled a bulky cell phone from her apron. Before she could dial, Dutch reached into his heavy leather boot with agonizing slowness. He pulled out something small, wrapped in a piece of oil-stained canvas, and a heavy silver ring adorned with a skull. With the last ounce of his strength, he grabbed Onyx's hand and shoved the items into her palm, closing her small fingers over them. "Hide it," Dutch whispered directly to Onyx, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, burning intensity. "Don't tell anyone, not the cops. If my brothers come, give it to Preacher, only Preacher." His eyes rolled back, and the massive biker went entirely limp, his dead weight slumping against the bloody pink windbreaker. Sarah screamed, dialing 911 frantically. As she yelled the location to the dispatcher, she didn't notice Onyx slipping the heavy ring and the canvas-wrapped package deep into the pocket of her jeans. By the time the paramedics and the state troopers arrived, the sun had fully set. The flashing red and blue lights painted the desert in a sickly glow. They loaded Dutch onto a stretcher. He was barely breathing. A state trooper questioned Sarah aggressively, eyeing the diner as if he suspected her of harboring fugitives. He asked if the biker had said anything or handed anything off. Sarah honestly answered no. Onyx, sitting quietly on the bumper of a squad car, clutching a paramedic's blanket, said absolutely nothing. Sarah didn't sleep a wink that night. Every creak of the diner's old floorboards, every gust of wind against the tin roof sounded like an approaching threat. Around 2 a.m., while doing laundry to scrub the blood out of Onyx's clothes, Sarah found it. A heavy silver ring with the letters HAMC etched into the band, and a small, leather-bound notebook that had been tightly wrapped in the canvas. Sarah's blood ran cold. She opened the notebook. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger, dates, initials, offshore account routing numbers, and a list of names, some of which belonged to high-ranking local politicians and law enforcement officials. Dutch hadn't just been in an accident. He had been carrying a death warrant. "What did you do?" "Onyx," Sarah whispered into the dark, her hands trembling so violently she dropped the book. If the people in the black SUV came looking for this, they were dead. If the Hell's Angels came looking for this and thought she had stolen it from a dying brother, they were worse than dead. Morning broke with a heavy, oppressive heat. Sarah unlocked the front door of the Rust and Rose at 6 a.m., her eyes ringed with dark circles. She had packed 2 duffel bags. Her plan was to serve whatever truckers came through for the morning rush, take the cash from the register, and drive north to Oregon by noon. They had to disappear. By 8 a.m., the diner was entirely empty. Not a single car had passed on Route 93 for nearly an hour. The silence was unnatural. It felt like the desert was holding its breath. Then, it began. It started as a low vibration, a frequency felt in the chest before it was registered by the ears. The coffee in the glass pots on the burners began to ripple. The silverware on the tables rattled softly against the formica. Sarah stepped out onto the front porch, shielding her eyes from the blinding morning sun. Down the long, straight ribbon of asphalt, a black mass was moving over the horizon. The low hum grew into a guttural, terrifying roar. It sounded like an approaching thunderstorm, localized entirely on the highway. Within minutes, they were there. It wasn't 5 bikers. It wasn't 10. It was an endless column of roaring chrome, heavy leather, and roaring V-twin engines. 150 Hell's Angels. They swarmed the diner like a mechanized army. They filled the dirt parking lot, blocked the highway in both directions, and surrounded the perimeter of the building. The air grew thick with the smell of exhaust, hot rubber, and unyielding intimidation. Sarah froze in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. The engines cut out in rolling waves, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in their wake. Dust swirled around heavy boots as men dismounted. They were massive, heavily tattooed, their faces grim and unreadable. Patches from California, Arizona, Nevada, and even as far as Washington were visible on their backs. They formed a semicircle around the front of the diner, standing shoulder to shoulder. A path cleared down the center of the formation. A single rider walked forward. He was taller than the rest, broad-shouldered, with a graying beard and a long scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline. The patch on his left breast simply read, President. This had to be Preacher. Sarah's survival instinct kicked in. She backed into the diner, locked the glass door, and ran to the kitchen. Onyx, get in the pantry. Hide behind the flour sacks and do not come out, she hissed, shoving the bewildered 8-year-old into the small closet. The front bell chimed as the glass door was shattered. The deadbolt kicked entirely out of the wooden frame with a single, brutal boot strike. Heavy footsteps echoed on the linoleum. Sarah stood behind the main counter, her hand secretly gripping a heavy cast-iron skillet beneath the register. It was a pathetic weapon against an army. But a mother's desperation knows no logic. Preacher walked to the counter. Up close, his presence was suffocating. He didn't look angry. He looked absolutely ruthless. Behind him, 4 other imposing bikers stepped into the diner, blocking the exit. You the owner. Preacher's voice was like grinding gravel. Yes, Sarah choked out, trying to keep her chin up. We're closed. Preacher ignored her. He looked around the diner, his eyes sweeping over the cheap vinyl booths and the dusty jukebox. My sergeant-at-arms, Dutch. He was found out back last night, almost bled to death in the dirt. I called the ambulance, Sarah said quickly, her voice raising in pitch. We found him. We helped him. I didn't see who ran him off. Preacher slowly rested his massive, calloused hands on the counter. He leaned in. I know you didn't see who ran him off, lady. Because if you did, you'd be in the morgue right now. But I also know that Dutch was carrying something very important to this club, something that wasn't on him when the paramedics cut his vest off. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah lied, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of her neck. Preacher stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, he reached into his leather cut, pulled out a massive 10-inch hunting knife, and slammed it blade first into the formica counter right between Sarah's hands. Sarah shrieked, jumping back. Don't lie to me, Preacher growled, the calmness in his voice entirely gone, replaced by a dark, simmering menace. We know what the little girl took from Dutch. We have eyes everywhere. Bring her out, or my brothers and I tear this place down to the foundation to find it." From the back of the diner, the small, squeaky hinges of the pantry door slowly creaked open. "Mom?" Onyx's small voice echoed in the tense, silent room. Preacher pulled the knife from the counter, turning his massive frame toward the hallway. The 150 men outside stood in absolute silence, waiting for their president's command. The small, squeaky hinges of the pantry door echoed like a gunshot in the silent diner. Onyx stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. She wasn't trembling, though her face was pale under the fluorescent lights. In her right hand, she clutched the heavy, oil-stained canvas package, and looped over her thumb was the massive silver skull ring. "Onyx! No!" Sarah screamed, lunging forward from behind the counter. Before Sarah could take 2 steps, the 4 massive bikers flanking the door moved with terrifying synchronization. They didn't draw weapons, but they formed a solid wall of leather and muscle, physically blocking the mother from her child. "Don't touch her!" Sarah shrieked, tears finally spilling hot over her cheeks. "Take whatever you want, just don't hurt my daughter." Preacher held up a single, heavily scarred hand. The room fell dead silent. He didn't look at Sarah. His dark, piercing eyes were entirely fixed on the 8-year-old girl walking slowly toward him. Onyx stopped 3 feet away from the president of the Hells Angels. She craned her neck upward, looking at the man who towered over her like a California redwood. "Are you Preacher?" Onyx asked, her voice steady, though small. Preacher slowly lowered himself to one knee, the heavy leather of his riding pants creaking. Now, he was at eye level with her. Up close, Onyx could see the intricate tattoos weaving around his neck and the deep lines of a life lived hard and violently. "I am," Preacher rumbled, his voice softening just a fraction. "And who might you be? Little bird." "I'm Onyx. Dutch told me to call you." She held out her small hand, opening her fingers to reveal the silver HAMC ring. "He told me to give you this. He said he was hurt bad by men in a black SUV. Preacher gently took the heavy ring from her palm. He turned it over in his calloused fingers, a flash of genuine grief crossing his hardened features. He slipped it into his vest pocket. "Dutch is a good man. He's in the hospital right now, fighting for his life. You kept him alive, Onyx. The paramedic said your jacket stopped the bleeding just enough." Onyx nodded, then held out the canvas-wrapped package. "He told me to hide this. He said I couldn't tell the police. He said only to give it to Preacher." The tension in the diner spiked. The 4 bikers at the door shifted, their hands dropping subtly toward their waistbands. Preacher took the package, unfolding the greasy canvas to reveal the small, black, leather-bound ledger. He thumbed open the pages, his eyes scanning the handwritten columns of dates, offshore routing numbers, and names. A cold, terrifying smile spread across Preacher's face. "Mother of God?" one of the bikers by the door muttered. "He actually got it." Preacher stood up, closing the ledger with a sharp snap. He looked over at Sarah, who was leaning against the counter, sobbing quietly. "Your daughter is a braver soldier than half the men I've ridden with. Lady, you have no idea what she just handed me." "I don't want to know," Sarah whispered frantically. "Please, just take it and leave. Leave us alone." "I wish it were that simple," Preacher said, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone. He walked over to the shattered front door, looking out at the 150 men swarming the parking lot. "This book, it's a list of every dirty DEA agent, every corrupt county judge, and every compromised sheriff in a 300-mile radius. Men who have been using our club's routes to move cartel fentanyl, trying to pin the bodies on us. Dutch spent 2 years undercover gathering this. Before Sarah could process the magnitude of what he was saying, the ground beneath the diner began to vibrate again. This time, it wasn't the rhythmic, thunderous rumble of Harley-Davidsons. It was the heavy, aggressive roar of high-powered V8 engines. Preacher's head snapped toward the highway. Speak of the devil! 3 massive, unmarked black Chevrolet Suburbans tore off Route 93, skidding violently into the dirt parking lot. The Hells Angels immediately reacted. The relaxed, waiting posture of the 150 bikers vanished in an instant. Men reached into their leather cuts, pulling out heavy steel chains, brass knuckles, and the cold, dark steel of semi-automatic pistols. They formed a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the front of the diner. The doors of the Suburbans flew open. Out poured a dozen men in heavy tactical gear. They wore bulletproof vests, but there were no police badges, no agency insignias, just heavily armed men gripping assault rifles, their faces covered by dark balaclavas. Leading them was a man Sarah recognized with a jolt of pure terror. It was Captain Harrison from the County Sheriff's Department. He was out of uniform, wearing a dark tactical vest and holding a Remington shotgun. He was the man who had come to the diner last year asking for protection money. "Preacher!" Harrison bellowed over the idling engines of the SUVs, racking a shell into the chamber of his shotgun. "This doesn't involve the club hand over the ledger, and you boys can ride back to Oakland with the wind in your hair. You keep it, and we leave 150 bodies in the Mojave." The arrival of the black SUVs crushed the air into silence. Heat shimmered above the asphalt as engines idled, and a wall of bikers stood unmoving, shoulder to shoulder. Across from them, armed men in tactical gear stepped out, rifles ready. They had the weapons, but the bikers had something colder, the willingness to die where they stood. Inside, Preacher didn't move. His voice, calm and sharp, cut through the tension. "Get the woman and the kid to the back. You shield them. No mistakes." Sarah was rushed behind heavy equipment, clutching Onyx tightly as fear rattled through her body. She prayed in silence, realizing the men she once feared were now her only protection. Onyx, however, stayed quiet, watching through a narrow gap, eyes fixed on the figures guarding them. Then Preacher stepped outside, boots crunching on broken glass. He walked into the open, exposed and unarmed, the black ledger resting in his hand, calm in the face of violence. "Harrison!" Preacher's voice boomed over the parking lot, rich, dark, and utterly devoid of fear. "You boys really screwed the pooch on this one. You ran my brother off the road. You spilled club blood on my highway. There is a heavy price for that." Captain Harrison leveled his Remington shotgun squarely at Preacher's chest. The corrupt deputy was sweating profusely beneath his heavy Kevlar vest, his eyes darting nervously across the sea of silent, staring bikers. "This doesn't involve the club, Preacher," Harrison shouted, though his voice lacked the authoritative bark he desired. "Dutch got greedy. He stuck his nose where it didn't belong, trying to play hero. Now throw the damn book over here, and you boys can ride back to Oakland with the wind in your hair. You keep it, and we leave 150 bodies rotting in the Mojave." Harrison took a step forward, gesturing with the barrel of his shotgun toward the diner. "We know the woman and the kid have seen our faces. Don't make us go through you to get to them. Nobody else has to die today if you just hand over the ledger." Preacher didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a low, rumbling chuckle that sent a visible shiver down the spine of the deputy standing closest to Harrison. It was the laugh of a predator who had just watched his prey walk willingly into a trap. "You think you're the only one who knows how to play the game?" Captain Preacher asked, stepping off the porch and walking directly toward the barrel of the shotgun. "You think I brought an army out here, blind, to play target practice with a bunch of bought-and-paid-for badge wearers?" Harrison's grip tightened on the shotgun pump. "What the hell are you talking about?" Preacher stopped 10 feet away. He held the little black leather book up to the blinding sunlight. "This book, it's just paper and ink. A souvenir. It's worthless now." Harrison frowned, his confusion warring with his anger. "Stop playing games. Preacher, throw the book." "The photographs I took of every single page inside this ledger with my encrypted phone 10 minutes ago." Preacher continued, ignoring the command entirely. "Those are already gone. They're currently sitting in the secure inbox of the FBI's Internal Affairs Division in D.C. And just for a little extra insurance, I CC'd the chief editor of the Los Angeles Times. I hit send right before you pulled up." The blood drained completely from Harrison's face, leaving him a sickly, pale grey. "By lunch, your offshore accounts will be frozen," Preacher said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "By dinner, your cartel bosses down in Sonora are going to see your faces plastered all over the national news for losing their money and exposing their supply lines. You're dead men walking. Harrison, the only question is whether you die out here in the dirt today or in a maximum security prison yard next week." The men behind Harrison deputies who had traded everything for easy money began to lower their assault rifles. One of them, a younger man with terrified eyes, took a frantic step back toward the open door of the Suburban. "You're bluffing!" Harrison spat, saliva flying from his lips. "You didn't send anything." "Am I?" Preacher smiled. It was a dark, terrifying expression. "Shoot me. Go ahead. Pull the trigger. But understand this if you do. My brothers will tear you and your men apart with their bare hands. You might take down 20 of us with those rifles, but the remaining 130 will rip your heads off before you can even reload. And then you burn anyway." The standoff hung by a razor-thin thread. The desert wind howled, kicking up dust around their boots. Harrison looked at the unwavering, hardened faces of the bikers. He looked at their heavy chains and cold eyes. He realized, with a sinking, nauseating dread, that Preacher was telling the absolute truth. The Hell's Angels were ready to embrace death. His men were not. "Back to the trucks," Harrison choked out, his voice trembling with defeated rage. "Fall back now." The tactical team didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled frantically back into the black Suburbans, nearly trampling each other in their haste. Tires spun wildly, kicking up a massive cloud of choking yellow dust as the SUVs violently reversed out of the dirt lot and sped away down Route 93, fleeing like cowards into the heat distortion on the horizon. A collective breath was released, but the Hell's Angels didn't cheer. They simply lowered their weapons, returning them silently to their waistbands and saddlebags. They had held the line. Preacher turned his back on the highway and walked back into the diner. He stepped into the wrecked kitchen, looking down at Sarah and Onyx, who were just beginning to stand up from behind the deep fryer. The 4 massive guards stepped aside, giving their president room. "It's over," Preacher said softly, his voice remarkably gentle compared to the monster he had been moments ago. "They're gone. They won't be coming back. The feds will be hunting them by sundown, and the cartels will be hunting them by midnight." Sarah scrambled to her feet, pulling Onyx tightly against her chest, her whole body shaking violently. "Thank you," she sobbed. completely overwhelmed. "Thank you for not letting them hurt us. I thought we were going to die." Preacher shook his head slowly. "You don't owe me a damn thing. Lady, we owe you." He reached inside his heavy leather cut and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was heavily worn and bulging at the seams. He tossed it onto the stainless steel prep counter. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed in the quiet kitchen. "There's 50 grand in cash in there," Preacher said, ignoring Sarah's gasp of absolute shock. "Dutch was carrying club funds when they ran him off the road. We consider it hazard pay for the mess we brought to your doorstep. Fix your front door. Pack up your life. Take the kid somewhere nice and safe. Send her to a decent school away from this wasteland." Sarah stared at the envelope, her mind entirely unable to comprehend the sudden reversal of her life's fortunes. I can't take this. It's too much." "It's not a request," Preacher stated firmly. Then, he knelt down one last time, ignoring the creaking of his knees, and looked directly at Onyx. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, beautifully embroidered patch. It was a miniature version of the winged death head, but with a small, golden halo hovering above the skull. "You're a brave kid, Onyx," Preacher said, gently pressing the patch into her small, dirty palm. "Braver than most grown men I know. You ever need anything, and I mean absolutely anything in this world, you find a guy flying our colors. You show them this patch, and you tell them Preacher said you're family. The club protects its own." Onyx smiled, her eyes shining as she tightly gripped the embroidered fabric. "Tell Dutch I hope he feels better." "I will. Little bird." Preacher smiled back. He stood up, tipped his head respectfully to Sarah, and walked out of the diner. A minute later, the terrifying, thunderous roar of 150 engines ignited simultaneously. Sarah and Onyx walked to the shattered doorway, holding hands, watching as the massive black swarm of motorcycles rolled out onto Route 93. They headed back toward the horizon, leaving nothing but dust, a fortune on the counter, and a changed life behind them. Sometimes, the greatest heroes don't wear capes, they wear heavy leather and ride loud motorcycles. This incredible real-life story proves that a single act of innocent kindness can turn the most hardened outlaws into guardian angels. If Onyx's bravery and the Hells Angels' terrifying loyalty left you speechless, hit that like button, share this incredible story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true stories. The thunder of heavy rain against the asphalt was drowned out by the sudden, deafening roar of 93 Harley-Davidson engines firing to life in perfect unison. They weren't riding for a rally or a turf war. They were riding because a barefoot 5-year-old girl had just stumbled into their bar, trembling, with a terrifying secret. The town of Blackwood, Oregon, was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, left their back doors unlocked, and trusted the quiet rhythm of suburban life. For Sarah Harper, a 28-year-old single mother working double shifts at the local diner, Blackwood was a sanctuary. After a messy divorce, she had moved her 8-year-old son, Tommy, and 5-year-old daughter, Lily, into a small, drafty, but affordable 2-story house at the dead end of Sycamore Drive. Things had finally started looking up when Sarah met Richard Gable. Rick was a local contractor, charming, handy, and seemingly devoted to Sarah and the kids. He fixed the leaky roof, brought groceries on Sundays, and always had a warm smile. But behind closed doors, when Sarah was away working the graveyard shift, The smile faded. Rick had a temper, a cold, simmering rage that Tommy, with the sharp intuition of an older brother, had noticed immediately. Tommy had tried to warn his mother, but Rick's manipulation was masterful. He convinced Sarah that Tommy was just acting out, struggling with the absence of his biological father. The nightmare began on a freezing Tuesday night in mid-November. Sarah had kissed her children goodbye at 10 p.m., pulling her uniform coat tight against the biting wind as she headed to her shift. Rick had offered to watch them, sitting in the living room recliner with a beer in hand, the television glowing with a muted football game. Upstairs, Lily was fast asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit, but Tommy was awake. He never slept when Rick was in the house. Around 11:30 p.m., a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. Lily startled awake, her heart pounding against her small ribs. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet padding silently against the worn hardwood floor. She crept to the top of the stairs and peered through the wooden banister. The scene below paralyzed her. The heavy oak coffee table was overturned. Tommy was on the floor, his lip bleeding, frantically scrambling backward towards the hallway. Rick was towering over him, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. "I told you to keep your mouth shut, you little brat," Rick hissed, his voice a terrifying, raspy whisper. He grabbed Tommy by the collar of his pajama shirt, lifting the 60-pound boy off the ground with sickening ease. "Leave my mum alone. I'm going to tell her about the money," Tommy screamed, thrashing wildly, his small fists connecting with Rick's chest. Lily clamped her hands over her mouth to muffle a scream. She didn't understand what money they were talking about, but she understood the violence. Rick didn't just hit Tommy, he systematically overpowered him. From her vantage point, Lily watched in frozen horror as Rick pulled a roll of thick silver duct tape and a coil of heavy nylon rope from his contractor's tool belt, items he had brought into the house intentionally. This wasn't a sudden loss of temper. This was planned. Tommy fought like a cornered animal, kicking and biting, but he was no match for a full-grown man. Within minutes, Rick had forced the boy onto his stomach, wrapping the rough nylon rope brutally tight around Tommy's wrists and ankles, hog-tying him. He slapped a piece of duct tape across the boy's mouth, cutting off his panicked cries. "Now," Rick panted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You're going to stay down there until I figure out what to do with you. And if your sister wakes up, I'll put her down there with you." Rick grabbed the rope binding Tommy's ankles and dragged the struggling boy across the kitchen linoleum. He opened the heavy wooden door leading to the unfinished basement. The basement was a damp, pitch-black space Sarah used only for storage, plagued by a faulty light switch and a heavy, rusted padlock on the outside, installed years ago by a previous owner. Rick dragged Tommy down the wooden stairs. The sickening thud, thud, thud of her brother's body hitting the steps echoed in Lily's ears. A moment later, Rick marched back up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and snapped the heavy padlock into place. Lily couldn't breathe. She knew Rick would come upstairs to check on her next. Panic, primal and sharp, flooded her 5-year-old brain. She ran back into her bedroom, but she knew hiding under the bed wasn't enough. The monster was in the house. She had to get help. She rushed into the small adjoining bathroom, climbing onto the edge of the porcelain bathtub. Above the tub was a small, rectangular window that pushed outward. It was a tight squeeze, even for her tiny frame. She pushed the glass open, the freezing November rain immediately lashing across her face. Below was the sloped roof of the back porch, leading down to the muddy backyard. Hearing Rick's heavy footsteps groaning on the staircase, Lily didn't hesitate. She squeezed her shoulders through the narrow opening, scraping her sides against the metal frame, and tumbled out into the stormy night just as the bathroom door swung open. The rain was relentless, a freezing downpour that soaked through Lily's thin cotton nightgown in seconds. She slid down the porch roof, landing hard in the mud below, scraping her knees. She didn't cry. The terror had pushed her past tears. All she could see in her mind was Tommy, bound and gagged in the terrifying darkness of the basement. She ran. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away from Sycamore Drive. She scrambled through the wet brush of the neighbor's yard, her bare feet sinking into the freezing mud, stepping on sharp twigs and rocks that cut her soles. Blackwood was practically shut down at this hour. The streetlights flickered in the storm, casting long, eerie shadows. Lily wandered for what felt like hours, shivering violently, her lips turning a faint shade of blue. Vehicles occasionally sped past on the main road, but they couldn't see the tiny figure in the darkness, and Lily was too terrified to wave them down, afraid it might be Rick looking for her. Eventually, the residential streets gave way to the industrial edge of town. Here, nestled between an abandoned lumber yard and a 24-hour gas station, sat the Iron Horse Saloon. It wasn't a family establishment. The parking lot was packed shoulder to shoulder with heavily modified, gleaming motorcycles. This was the local clubhouse for the Steel Brotherhood, a notorious motorcycle club. They were big, heavily tattooed men in leather cuts, known for their intimidating presence, loud engines, and a fiercely guarded brotherhood. To the town, they were roughnecks. To a 5-year-old girl in the dead of night, they were monsters of a different kind. But Lily was desperate, freezing to death, and completely out of options. The neon sign of the bar flickered a warm, inviting red. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and damp leather. Classic rock blared from a jukebox in the corner. Big Mike. Henderson, the president of the Steel Brotherhood, was sitting at the head of a long wooden table. Mike was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4", with a thick grey beard, arms covered in faded prison ink, and a scar running through his left eyebrow. He was mid-laugh, telling a story to his vice president, a wiry man known as Sully, when the heavy wooden front door of the bar creaked open. The wind howled into the room, cutting through the heavy air. At first, nobody noticed. Then, Sully squinted toward the entrance. "Hey, close the damn door!" he barked. No one moved to close it, because standing in the doorway, illuminated by the harsh overhead light of the porch, was a ghost. Lily stood trembling violently, her pink nightgown plastered to her skin, completely coated in mud and blood from her scraped knees and feet. Her hair was matted to her face, and her wide, terrified eyes scanned the room full of giant, intimidating men. The music suddenly seemed too loud. Big Mike stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. The entire bar, nearly 100 bikers, fell dead silent. The contrast was jarring, a room full of hardened outlaws staring at a broken, freezing child. "Holy hell," muttered Doc, the club's resident mechanic and former army medic, immediately dropping his pool cue. Big Mike didn't run. He walked slowly, deliberately, dropping to one knee a few feet away from the girl so he wouldn't tower over her. Up close, he could see her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. He immediately unzipped his heavy, fur-lined leather jacket and wrapped it around her tiny shoulders. It swallowed her completely. "Hey there, little bird," Mike said, his voice surprisingly deep and gentle, a stark contrast to his fearsome appearance. "Where's your mama? Who did this to you?" Lily gripped the edges of the leather jacket. She looked into Mike's eyes. They were weathered and tough, but they weren't cruel like Rick's. She took a shaky breath, her tiny chest heaving. "He tied up my brother," she sobbed, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the room. "He tied up my brother and locked him in the basement." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mike's jaw tightened. "Who did, sweetheart? Who tied him up?" "Rick," she cried, burying her face into the massive leather sleeve of Mike's jacket. "He had tape. He put it on Tommy's mouth. Please. He's in the dark. He's going to hurt him." Mike didn't ask another question. He didn't ask for a last name, and he didn't call the police. He stood up, lifting Lily effortlessly into his arms, holding her safely against his chest. He turned to face the room. The silence was gone, replaced by a low, dangerous rumble of 93 men shifting on their feet. There was no discussion needed. The code of the Brotherhood was simple. You do not touch women, and you never touch children. "Doc," Mike barked. "Get her in the back. Get her warm, clean those cuts, and keep her safe. Do not leave her side." Doc nodded, stepping forward and gently taking the bundled girl from Mike. "I got her, boss." Mike turned to Sully, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. "Sully, get the address out of her." Gently. Within 60 seconds, Sully emerged from the back room. "Sycamore Drive, dead end, house with the blue shutters." Mike walked behind the bar and grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from beneath the register, slapping it into his palm. He looked out at his men, 93 bikers, all staring back at him, their expressions universally hardened into masks of righteous fury. They reached for heavy flashlights, chains, and tire irons. "Mount up," Mike growled. The exodus was instantaneous. 93 men poured out of the saloon into the freezing rain. Kickstands were kicked up in a massive metallic wave. Ignitions turned. And then, the roar. 93 heavy V-twin engines exploded to life, vibrating the pavement, shaking the rain from the awnings. It was a terrifying, beautiful sound. It was the sound of consequences. Mike kicked his bike into gear, leading the massive wedge of steel and leather out of the parking lot. They didn't obey speed limits. They didn't stop at red lights. They tore through the sleeping streets of Blackwood like a mechanized thunderstorm. A tidal wave of chrome and headlights cutting through the darkness, heading straight for Sycamore Drive. Back at the house, Rick Gable had just cracked open a fresh beer. He was sitting on the couch, entirely oblivious to the fact that his time had just run out. He thought he was perfectly safe, a wolf in his own den. He didn't know that an entire pack of wolves was currently turning down his street, their headlights illuminating the blue shutters of the house, preparing to tear his world apart. The vibration hit the floorboards before the sound even reached the house. Rick Gable, slouched in Sarah's floral-patterned recliner, felt the half-empty beer bottle in his hand begin to tremble. He frowned, muted the television, and sat forward. A low, rhythmic thunder was rolling through the sleepy Blackwood neighborhood. It sounded like a freight train had somehow jumped the tracks and was barreling down the residential street. Then came the lights. A blinding, synchronized wave of high beams swept across the living room walls, illuminating the dust motes in the air and casting long, erratic shadows. The roar of the engines grew deafening, an overwhelming wall of sound that rattled the picture frames on the mantel and made the glass in the front windows vibrate dangerously. Rick stood up, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He moved to the window, pulling back the edge of the cheap vinyl blind. His stomach dropped. The entire street, from the dead-end cul-de-sac all the way back to the main intersection, was choked with chrome, black leather, and glaring headlights. Dozens upon dozens of heavy motorcycles had surrounded the property. They were parked on the lawn, blocking the driveway, and idling on the sidewalks. The engines cut off in a staggered, rolling wave, leaving a sudden, terrifying silence, broken only by the heavy downpour of the November rain and the hiss of cooling exhaust pipes. Through the rain-streaked glass, Rick watched as nearly 100 massive men dismounted. They moved with military precision, wordless and purposeful. A giant of a man with a grey beard and a heavy leather jacket stepped to the front of the pack. In his right hand, he carried a solid steel crowbar. Panic, icy and sharp, finally pierced Rick's arrogant facade. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. Who were they? How did they know? He glanced toward the kitchen, toward the basement door. The girl, he realized with a sickening jolt. She wasn't in her room. Before he could even turn to run toward the back door, the front porch groaned under heavy boots. Crack. The solid wood of the front door splintered as a size 14 steel-toed boot connected with the deadbolt. The doorframe shattered, sending shards of wood flying across the entryway rug. The door flew open, rebounding hard against the interior wall. Big Mike stepped over the threshold, the freezing wind and rain swirling in behind him. Flanking him were Sully, gripping a heavy maglite flashlight, and half a dozen other bikers, their faces hardened into expressions of absolute, chilling resolve. Rick scrambled backward, knocking over a side table. Hey, you can't be in here! I'm calling the cops!" he stammered, his voice cracking, the tough guy persona evaporating instantly. "Do it!" Mike growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Call them. Tell them what's in the basement." Rick froze, his eyes darting frantically toward the kitchen. It was the only confirmation the bikers needed. "Secure him," Mike ordered, barely looking at Rick. 3 bikers lunged forward. Rick tried to swing a wild punch, but a heavily tattooed biker named Bear caught his wrist mid-air, twisting it backward with a sickening pop. Rick screamed as he was slammed face first onto the living room floor, a heavy knee driving into his spine, pinning him to the carpet. Mike didn't wait to watch the struggle. He strode through the living room, his heavy boots leaving muddy tracks on the linoleum as he entered the kitchen. He saw the overturned coffee table, the scuff marks on the floor, and then the heavy wooden door with the rusted padlock. Mike jammed the wedge of the steel crowbar into the gap between the padlock and the hasp. With a single, brutal heave of his massive shoulders, the rusted metal shrieked and snapped. The lock clattered uselessly to the floor. He ripped the door open. The smell of damp earth and mold drifted up from the pitch-black stairwell. "Sully, light!" Mike barked. Sully stepped up, shining the heavy maglite down the stairs. The powerful beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty concrete floor below. There, huddled in the farthest corner behind a stack of cardboard boxes, was Tommy. The 8-year-old boy was shaking violently. His wrists and ankles were bound tight with rough nylon rope, the skin around them chafed and bleeding. A thick strip of silver duct tape was plastered across his mouth. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it made Mike's chest ache. The boy thought the men breaking in were Rick's friends, coming to finish the job. Mike handed the crowbar to Sully and descended the stairs slowly, holding his hands out in front of him, palms open. "Hey, buddy," Mike said gently, softening his deep voice as much as possible. "It's okay. My name is Mike. Your sister, Lily, she sent me. She's safe, Tommy. She's safe and warm." At the sound of his sister's name, the rigid terror in Tommy's eyes broke, replaced by welling tears. Mike knelt beside the boy, pulling a small, razor-sharp pocket knife from his vest. "I'm gonna get this tape off first, okay? It might sting a little, but I'll be quick." Tommy nodded frantically. Mike grabbed the edge of the duct tape and peeled it back as swiftly and gently as he could. Tommy gasped, taking a massive gulp of air, his chest heaving as he began to sob. "It's okay, son. I got you," Mike murmured, using the blade to slice through the thick nylon ropes, binding the boy's wrists and ankles. The moment his hands were free, Tommy didn't rub his chafed wrists. He threw his arms around Mike's thick neck, burying his face in the man's leather vest, crying with the uninhibited desperation of a child who had thought he was going to die in the dark. Mike wrapped his massive arms around the boy, lifting him up effortlessly. "Let's get you out of this damp hole." When Mike carried Tommy up the stairs and into the kitchen, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Rick was still pinned to the floor in the living room, bleeding from a cut on his cheek, completely surrounded by towering men in leather. Tommy tightened his grip on Mike's neck as they walked past Rick. "Look at the floor, scum!" Bear growled at Rick, shoving the man's face back into the carpet, so he couldn't even make eye contact with the boy he had tortured. "Sully," Mike said, his voice cold again. "Take the boy out to the support truck. Turn the heat on blast. Doc is on his way with the girl." As Sully escorted Tommy out the front door, wrapped in a dry flannel shirt, Mike turned his attention back to Rick. But before Mike could decide how much frontier justice to dispense, another biker, a former locksmith known as Keys, walked out of the master bedroom holding a heavy black canvas duffel bag. Keys tossed it onto the floor next to Rick's head. The bag landed with a heavy metallic clink. "Found this shoved up in the air vent in the bedroom," Keys said, his brow furrowed. "He wasn't just hiding from the kid, boss. He was hiding this." Mike knelt, unzipping the heavy canvas bag. The twist of the night tumbled out onto the floor. It wasn't tools, it wasn't clothes. It was dozens of tightly banded stacks of $100 bills, 4 different burner cell phones, a loaded 9mm Glock, and a passport. Mike picked up the passport and flipped it open. The photo was undeniably Rick Gable, but the name printed beside it was Richard Kellerman. Mike looked down at the bleeding, pathetic man on the floor. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together. This wasn't just a domestic abuser. Rick wasn't a local contractor who had fallen for a single mum. He was a fugitive using Sarah's isolated dead-end house and her trusting nature as a blind front to hide cash and lay low. Tommy hadn't just interrupted a bad mood. The 8-year-old had stumbled upon the stash. He had found the money, and Rick was going to make sure the boy never told his mother about it. "Well, Richard," Mike said softly, the danger in his voice absolute. "Looks like you picked the wrong house to hide in." 10 minutes later, the wail of police sirens finally pierced the storm. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the rain as 5 Blackwood police cruisers swarmed Sycamore Drive, effectively blocking the bikers in. A squad of officers poured out, weapons drawn, shouting orders over the roar of the rain. Confronting nearly 100 outlaw bikers in a residential neighborhood was a tactical nightmare. But what they found shocked them even more. The bikers didn't run, they didn't draw weapons, they simply stood in a massive, silent perimeter around the house and the club's support truck, their hands resting visibly on their belts. Detective Arthur Higgins, a 20-year veteran of the force, pushed through the perimeter. "Mike!" he shouted, recognizing the towering club president. "What the hell is going on here? We got a call about a gang invasion." Mike stood on the porch, holding the black duffel bag. He didn't flinch at the drawn firearms. "You're late, Artie," Mike called back, "but we wrapped a present for you in the living room." Higgins cautiously entered the house, flanked by 2 officers. He found Richard Kellerman, still pinned to the floor, terrified, but alive. Higgins then looked at the snapped padlock in the kitchen and the bloody nylon rope discarded on the floor. Mike tossed the passport and one of the bundles of cash onto the kitchen counter. "He's not Rick Gable. He's Kellerman." Tied up the 8-year-old boy, threw him in the basement because the kid found his stash. The 5-year-old girl escaped out a window and ran 2 miles barefoot to our saloon. Higgins blanched, staring at the duct tape and the rope. The hostility between the police and the bikers evaporated instantly, replaced by a shared, silent disgust for the man on the floor. Higgins holstered his weapon. "Get him up," Higgins ordered his officers, his voice dripping with contempt. "Read him his rights, and make sure the cuffs are tight." As the police dragged Rick out to a cruiser, a battered Honda Civic tore past the police barricade, sliding to a halt on the wet grass. Sarah Harper burst from the driver's seat. She had been called at the diner by a neighbor who heard the commotion. She looked at the shattered door, the police, the bikers, and let out a guttural scream of pure terror. "My babies! Where are my kids?" Mike stepped out of the rain, placing a massive, calloused hand gently on her shoulder. "They're safe, Mum. They're right here." He led her to the club's heated support truck. The doors opened, and Sarah collapsed to her knees in the mud as Tommy and Lily, bundled in oversized jackets and blankets, scrambled out of the truck and into her arms. The family clung to each other, sobbing in the pouring rain, while 93 hardened bikers stood in the storm in absolute respectful silence, creating a human shield around their reunion. In the weeks that followed, the truth unspooled. Richard Kellerman was a mid-level money launderer for a regional narcotics syndicate. He had been on the run for 6 months, charming his way into Sarah's life precisely because her home was off the radar, and her long working hours gave him the perfect cover to run his operations. He was facing federal charges that would lock him away for the rest of his natural life. Sarah and her children moved out of the house on Sycamore Drive a month later. The memories were too dark to paint over, but they didn't leave Blackwood. They stayed because they found out they weren't alone. When Sarah's car broke down, Doc showed up to fix it, refusing payment. When Tommy went back to school, he didn't ride the bus. For the first month, a rotating escort of 3 roaring Harley-Davidsons followed him all the way to the drop-off line, ensuring he felt like the safest, most untouchable kid in the world. And little Lily, who had braved the storm to save her brother, was given a custom-made, tiny leather cut of her own, making her the first and only honorary member of the Steel Brotherhood. That freezing November night changed Blackwood forever. 93 bikers didn't just save a little boy, they dismantled a fugitive's empire and forged an unbreakable bond with a shattered family. Today, Tommy and Lily never walk home alone, knowing an entire brotherhood rides behind them. Sometimes, the truest heroes don't wear shining armor. They wear scuffed leather, ride loud steel, and answer the desperate call of the vulnerable.